Welcome, everyone. My name is Shreya, and I'm an associate of MAP. Thanks for coming down for this masterclass with Tony Glennie. Tony is the investment director at Starfish Ventures. He has experience on both sides of the table. Prior to his involvement with Starfish Ventures, he developed a presentation software, which was then acquired by Google. As a VC, Tony sees hundreds of pitches every year, and he will be giving you advice and tips on how you can improve your pitch. So without further ado, would you please join me welcoming Tony Glennie?
Great, thanks very much, and welcome everyone. It's good to be back here. I gave a very similar presentation last year. It was a much smaller crowd, so it's good to see some of these MAP events really catching on. And hopefully we can go through some stuff today that you will find very useful coming up in terms of how to pitch. So as was just mentioned, I work at Starfish Ventures. We see on average maybe a little over 300 opportunities a year. Not all of those come to pitch, probably only maybe 100 a year. But nevertheless, over the little over 5 years I've been at Starfish Ventures, seen very many pitches, and I certainly have my preferences over what I think works and doesn't work. And certainly other people have, I think from time to time, different ideas. But let's go through with what I think, and then at the end, very happy to take any questions or to chat about any of the stuff I've put forward. So firstly, when we start with point, excellent. All right. So the first thing about pitching is to start off with what's your mission, and that is really you've got to present enough information about your company or business to be interesting. And secondly, and this is I think often underrated, is to fit the pitch within the time provided. Plenty of entrepreneurs come to us, they're very excited, they can't wait to tell us or tell me all about their company, and they get about halfway through and they're out of time. You do not want that to happen, because as I said, we've got a great many pitches. My time, for better for worse, gets scheduled, and if we're at the out of time, I've got to go. So, and you definitely do not want to, end the meeting without even actually telling me what you want to raise or how much or what for. So, super important to fit the pitch in the time provided. And to that end, you really want to prepare, a few versions of your pitch. Everyone kind of talks about the classic elevator pitch, 30 seconds to a minute. But more so, like, how would you present your company in half an hour versus an hour? And they're probably the two main time slots that you should cater for. The other thing you definitely want to do is allow time for questions. You should definitely practice your pitch and, going through it. And, but when you do that, you'll do that much faster in practice than you will in an actual meeting. So if you're practicing for an hour, do not practice, basically what you'll get through in about 15 minutes on your own will probably take, half an hour to 45 minutes in front of an audience. It just moves more slowly. Definitely you should speak more slowly. Also, you want to allow plenty of time for questions. There's nothing better for you as an entrepreneur, pitching, than to get those questions, because pretty much that means that you've at least accomplished the first point on this mission statement, which is you're interesting, because I'm interested in learning more about certain aspects of your business. So definitely leaving room for questions is, also part of planning the time allotment. But now, when you go into pitch, the first question is, well, what's the purpose of the meeting? And some might think, oh, it's, generally speaking, it's because I want to raise money. And I would say definitely not. What you want to get is another meeting. It is extremely rare to non-existent that anyone is going to write you a check after one meeting. So the whole point is to be interesting, certainly interesting enough to get another meeting. This actually is perhaps more insightful, hopefully, than it at first seems, because the implication of this is that you don't have to tell everything about your company in meeting number one. You just want to be interesting, right? And so we're going to go through in a minute, I think the key aspects you do need to touch on, but you don't need to go to every last detail. Because firstly, you should say, well, if this is going to, certainly say to yourself anyway, if this is going to progress, there's going to be plenty of time for the would-be investor, certainly the institutional investor, such as a Starfish Ventures, for us to find out more information, to dig in and understand the business. But what, certainly that initial meeting, it's marketing, right? You just want to present your business in the best possible light, yet, be accurate and informative. So in terms of, the overall pitch structure, getting now down to some more of the details, like I would say there's two big questions that certainly I care about as an investor. First thing is the problem, right? What is the issue that you're trying to solve for? And there's a few elements, that encompass what the problem is, beyond just, the difficulty that a certain group of customers or businesses are having with some topic. There's the business need, how desperately do they need this? What are they currently using today? What are the alternatives? How many businesses or how many people have this issue? And who else is, in the landscape? Who else is providing solutions or workarounds or, ways that you can accomplish the same thing? And there always are those other ways, but we'll get on to competitors a bit later on. And then the second big area is around, the solution. So what is it that you're actually offering? And, the topics around that I think are interesting, obviously what your product or service is, but also your business model, which is, how you're going to make money by delivering this product or service, and, kind of the team, who's geared up to deliver on that, kind of value proposition. So I would say they're the two big buckets. Like in that first meeting, you definitely want to spend time, what's the problem? What's the solution? So in terms of delivering, kind of those messages, I put together, I'd say a few tips that, I would, I think find makes a pitch the most interesting. And that's, what we've already said is the goal. Firstly, to create a narrative. Certainly when we go through these slides and the tips that you the sections that you want to cover, don't treat them as a checkbox. Although, yes, you want to check the box that each of these are present, make sure they're present in the narrative, which is, you're telling a story about how customers, have this problem and there are lots of them and they're willing to pay for it and we're solving this problem in this way and we're going to make money by doing these things. And it's going to be a really profitable business because of this. And right there, I've just touched on, the 5 elements of, the business of the pitch that we're going to get to in a bit more detail. But that's kind of it as a narrative. Also, I think each slide, you really want to understand, what the key message is of that slide. So that when you present your slides, you don't just read from them, you just have a point that you're trying to make. So that each slide really has ideally one key point, maybe two, but you should know, like at the end of this slide, I want the listener to be feeling or, to have understood, something. And you should know what that is. And ideally, you don't communicate that directly, but you talk around it. So that's, if you will, that's the objective. And as I said earlier, don't present every last detail around your business. And certainly that can be difficult to do because you're passionate about it, you love it, and perhaps they even ask a question that really hits on some tricky or insightful or something, part of the problem that you've solved. And it's really tempting to just dive right in. And I would say, you don't need to do that, and you don't need to do it for at least a couple of reasons. One is, if it leaves them wanting a bit more, well, that's good, because then you get that second meeting. But also, it'll take a lot of time, so that if you, jump in to a whole bunch of detail, then on one little topic, then you may run out later on in the pitch. As I said, allow time for questions. Definitely want to keep slides clean. Hopefully those two things or certainly the keeping slides clear is pretty straightforward. Also, I definitely recommend using specifics to illustrate general points. And one, or perhaps it's best to give an example of that. So if you want to make a general point of, customers having a certain problem, then rather than saying, I don't know, like if we were to pick and just, like a company like Xero, which does online financial software, if you want to say, oh, look, and perhaps, when they were doing the pitch against MYOB, which at the time, it was a classic desktop accounting system, where they say, rather than say there's a real problem with desktop software, people want to share it and they want to share it in the cloud, it's much, I think, more compelling if you can say, when I did my taxes, I sent these, my forms to the accountant, and when they tried to process, and when they put it in, I wanted to see, the results of that tax return, but I couldn't get to it. Or they had to send it to me via email, like where you use a very specific case, and then you say, and that case can be generalized. You say, and lots of people have this problem. I think that makes it, and certainly for, the business area or, the problem that you're trying to solve, you should really be an expert on both, how big a problem it is, but some specific examples, and ideally specific examples that you've solved, so that it really brings home that, yep, people had this problem, and using your product, tool, service, whatever, they got a solution. I just think that, makes it so much more understandable. And particularly because we as investors, unfortunately, can't know everything about everything. So you would absolutely hope that the entrepreneur is going to know 10 times more about their business than I do, which, to put it another way, is I know 1/10 as much, if that, as they do. So if you can paint a very clear example for me about, what the point is you're trying to make, certainly the specifics to illustrate that general point, I think that's very helpful. Also, throughout the whole pitch, you definitely want to think about what is not going to be obvious to the investor that perhaps you should spend the time explaining. And usually with any business, like if you look at those two big categories we touched on before, the problem or the solution, generally one of those at least is going to be more non-intuitive than the other. So again, a specific example would be if you had invented, let's say, cold fusion, right? Like this little tiny thing that could generate, an enormous amount of electricity very cheaply, which is, something which would be basically a breakthrough in science. You don't need to spend a lot of time describing the market opportunity for cheap electricity, right? I think people get it, that, yep, that's billions of dollars. Let's take it as a given, that problem. So you can touch on it, but the problem isn't the issue, it's the solution. What you should say is, what you should be aware of is you're going to need to spend the time explaining how you've solved cold fusion. And throughout the your pitch, there's definitely elements that are less obvious than others, and they can be subtle. Like it could be the go-to market strategy. Again, if you're doing more consumer-related businesses like bottled water, let's say, I think the problem, aside from the fact that there really probably isn't an actual problem, there's plenty of bottled water, but what the need is, I guess people want to, buy water for various reasons. There we go, beautiful. But I would say the key to selling bottled water is going to be the marketing. Like, who are you going to appeal to? What's the market segment? That's the non-obvious part of bottled water, right? And for whatever you're doing, you just want to think through and say, which parts of this am I, and at some level, you can think of it as your secret sauce. Like, where have you innovated? Like, what is the compelling thing about your business? And it's absolutely fine that there's more than one. There could be a number. They could all tie in together. But whether it's, you've identified a problem that no one's really seen before, that here's a way you could do something, or a solution, an invention or this or that, or it's a go-to-market strategy that's really interesting, or a business model, like when SaaS, software as a service, charging on a recurring basis came out. That was pretty innovative. No one thought you could do that. And if you were pitching one of the very early SaaS businesses, you'd want to spend time explaining why people will pay for software, the same piece of software, year after year, forever, versus paying one fee. I'd say, yeah, that's pretty non-obvious. You might want to spend some time on it. But yeah, it's true. People will. There's very good reasons for it. But, that's the sort of thing you'd want to explore. So, really, with that in mind, maybe let's actually turn to the specifics of the pitch deck itself. And I've kind of already outlined, we've got these two big topic areas we want to cover. So the question is, how do we want to cover them? And as I go through these next set of slides, I should also just mention that a few of this stuff I've stolen off the internet. So from this, actually a link, which when I researched this topic a few years ago, I thought, someone must have put together these really good pitch decks. So I did a bit of a Google search, found some references and thought, yeah, I actually agreed with them. So I've used a few of those, so I should definitely acknowledge that some of the material from these slides anyway comes from there. So in terms of, the core elements of a pitch, yep, wrong, same thing. I've highlighted in red there, here's what I think, the 5 things you really need to cover are the problem, the solution, the market opportunity, the business model, how you're going to make money from selling a solution, and the financial projections. Why you're going to, showing how you're going to make a lot of money using your business model. So if you had a 30-minute time slot or 15 minutes, I would still try to cover those 5 things, even in 15 minutes, even in 5 minutes. But I'd pare back each of those 5 sections to fit within that time. If you have a longer amount of time, and I think most often you do, then I'd look at, trying to add in something like cover slide, whatever. But the elevator pitch part, which is where you kind of set the scene, just to get people understanding where you're even coming from, where the Airbnb of this or the Uber of that. The team, a very important part of it. The competition, how much money you're asking for. I think those other elements definitely important, but not as important as those 5. Like, I just would not show up with a deck that did not touch on those 5 things. So jumping into a bit of detail around, each of those, however many things, was it about 10 slides? So let's have a look specifically at what you might want to put on each of those slides. So the cover slide is really pretty much what I started off with. They're just their Starfish Ventures, name and date, whatever it is. It's a bit of a nothing thing. All you want to do is just, create a positive initial impression. You don't really need to do much more than that. I don't think you really need to speak to this slide. What you just want to do is introduce yourself and move on. Get into the meat and potatoes, as quickly as possible. So again, this elevator pitch I mentioned was optional. If you don't have time for it, because the meeting is too short, that's fine. But definitely, if you do have time, it can be helpful just for the investor if they've come from back-to-back meetings. Maybe their brain is, thinking about, some hardware solution provider or something, or some issue that one of their portfolio companies is having, and you're walking in there. This gives them just a little bit of a chance to get their head into the space about what the next bits are all about. So all this is about, I'd say, is setting the scene, and you can do it as, where the X of Y, as I said, the Facebook of, Facebook for business, or, whatever it is, I think that can be helpful just to make sure that the person listening to the pitch, their head is in your space. So the problem, I think, this is definitely a, key slide getting into the meat and potatoes. What you really want to accomplish here is, to the best of your ability, illustrate that there's a compelling business need for what it is you're delivering. Because ultimately, further in the deck, we're going to say why people are going to pay for it and how much money you're going to make. And that's just not going to be believable, or certainly not as compelling, if, people from the get-go don't believe that there's a real problem to be solved. So, and you definitely want to be specific about, what it is you are solving for. And I think the more clearly you can present that, the better. Where, are you saving labour, making something more efficient? Are you enabling something that couldn't be done previously to be done now, something that would take a long time to be done in a short time? Like, what actually, is the problem? Like, people are taking a long time to do this, or people can't do this at all, or it costs them way too much money. I think that's definitely what you want to think of as your key message, so that when when you leave this slide, you've got acknowledgement that, yep, that sounds like that's a problem for businesses. And definitely with this, you want to describe how bad the situation is, like what an individual or a business goes through. You don't need to address how many businesses, have this thing, because that's, really moving into the market opportunity, which we'll get to, in a couple of slides. So after you've described the problem, so you've got people nodding along to, yep, I can see why that would be a problem. Then I think it's logical part of your narrative to get into the solution. So, here's how we've solved it. And definitely, you want to be very specific on how your product or solution really solves that problem. If you can demonstrate your product, that's good, but it can be risky. Demos, live demos always seem to, well, not always, but often go wrong, things don't work. Maybe where you are, there's bad Wi-Fi connectivity. There's plenty of ways for it to go wrong. So other means to illustrate it are good. If you're actually selling a physical product, bringing either a prototype or a mock-up or something along is good. If it is a software solution and you've got a canned video, something short, sharp, to the point, that can be very effective and, often more reliable than doing a truly live demo. And as I said before, tell a story about how, your fictitious or actual, or even actual, probably even better, customer had their problem and they've solved it using your solution. So once you've talked kind of to the specifics, here's a problem, here's the solution, I think it makes sense then to move on to, what's the market opportunity? How many people have this problem? If you will, in your narrative, you say, people have this problem, we've solved it, and there's a lot of people that have this problem. And this is what you're kind of addressing in the market opportunity. I think you want to be very careful how you speak to your addressable market, like how many people you can actually sell your product or service to. Many pitches that I get, this would probably be, certainly my top 5 problems or issues I see with decks, is they describe a really large addressable market. For example, if you're selling, we'll stick with the Xero example just for now. If that was your business and you were selling, a financial package as a service, I think it's ridiculous to walk into a pitch and say, and the total value of enterprise software or small business, the amount that small businesses spend on software is $10 billion. Because, they do, that's fine, but they don't spend 10 billions on financial services, if that includes, the productivity suite and the email and the this and the that. Like, it's just a meaningless number. And I think the more specific you can be around this, the more impressive, certainly for this section, the more impressed I'm going to be. Because if you really understand your addressable market, like exactly who are you selling to and how many people have this, have the problem, then it's going to be much more believable later on if, you start to do your financial projections and you also start to speak about, for example, in your business model stage, how you're going to reach these people, what your go-to-market strategy is. If you can be specific about who you're selling to, well, that goes a long way to, answering the question about how you're going to sell to them. Yeah, and one other thing is probably worth noting is that with the market opportunity, more often than not, bigger is better, right? Like if you've got a really big market opportunity, because there's, millions of small businesses, for example, that have this problem, and they spend this much money, that's all good. That's fine, but it's not necessarily the death of a business. In fact, it can be very successful if you have only a very few people that have this problem. But the key to that is they have to be willing to pay a lot. So there's, for example, a company, Viva, that provides a Salesforce type solution, so a CRM solution built on top of Salesforce, and they only sell it to the big pharma companies. So maybe there's, 50 of those big pharma companies, but each of them pay a couple of $1 million a year. So Viva, which now makes, well over 100 million in annual recurring revenues, worth well over $1 billion, and they only have, relatively few customers. But that's okay as long as they can kind of show that the problem they're solving, people will pay a lot for. So the team, so really what you want to achieve here is, as part of your narrative, at least I think, is to show that, or to illustrate why you're the right team to deliver on this, opportunity. So you've said, yep, here's the problem, we've found a solution, a lot of people have this problem, and we are the people to do it. And ideally you kind of want to have the idea of why you're uniquely the team of people to do it. Because otherwise, arguably, people say, well, maybe you should, it's all good and everything else, but execution is everything. And if you're not the right team to execute, maybe it's better, to explore some other opportunity around selling that technology or doing something. But either way, that's not helping you as the entrepreneur wanting to raise money. So, presenting why you're the right team is definitely important. And ideally, you do have unique expertise in this area. You certainly want to have knowledge about that marketplace or the that addressable market. Certainly, plenty of entrepreneurs come in. They have certainly in software it's easy to do. I've done this myself. Is where you kind of imagine a problem. Like you've seen people use spreadsheets or how they do it, and then you create a solution that addresses the problem that you think they've got. And there's obviously plenty of these businesses. But if you don't really understand those businesses, you're going to leave off many factors that would make the solution actually truly viable. And there's plenty of them. And often you get caught up in the smallest of things that like details that change everything. Maybe the procurement cycle for these businesses is years long, so that even though you've got the best solution and the best answer, that in fact it doesn't matter because they take so long to buy. Actually, an example that comes to mind is the airline industry. Like if you invent a better way of doing something for an aeroplane, that can be extremely valuable. There are plenty of planes, all this stuff, but the cycle to get something in a plane, I think is the order of 20 years, maybe 30 years. So nothing on these planes happens quickly. And if you're a small business and you've invented a better tire rubber for them to land or some extra suspension or something, because you might have been done aeronautics and engineering, you truly are the world's expert in planes. You've truly, it is a problem, you've solved it. But if you don't understand that, there's this ridiculous approval cycle, then that is pretty material to your business. And that's why, demonstrating your team has these capabilities, not just around the solution, but also in your market space is important. But the other thing to note is that if you don't have the right team, more to the point is maybe you're missing a couple of people who you acknowledge that, yep, we need to find this person. That's fine to point that out. Like, it's not unreasonable that one of the main reasons, you're raising capital is to hire more people. And if you've identified, here's the people we want, here's the skill set they need to have, that's okay. There's a limit to that, of course, because on the one hand, it's good that you acknowledge we need this gap filled, but you don't want to be so acknowledging of these gaps that the whole thing looks like Swiss cheese, that you don't really have, like, what are you even bringing to the table now? Because we've really got to hire a new team. So a bit of a two-edged sword there. But it's regardless of the two edges of the sword, it's absolutely better to acknowledge what you're missing up front than to stay silent on it and try to fudge it over. So the competition. So this again is, I think, an area often unloved in the pitch deck. And one of the reasons can be is because if the team has a lack of familiarity with the space that they're in, then they also have a bit of a lack of familiarity with how people are solving that problem today. And competition is, a fairly broad thing, because your competition isn't necessarily, this other company that's selling a better widget or a widget that's in a different color sort of thing. Most often, or certainly quite often, your number one competitor is status quo, is that most businesses will choose to do nothing in the absence of compelling reasons to do otherwise. And given they already exist, right, we can't argue these businesses exist, and they're going along for better, for worse, they're muddling their way through, it's often fair to say they don't truly need you, right? So status quo is kind of easy for them because, you know, there's no risk. There may not be any upside, but, you know, at least they're not going to lose a bunch of money investing in this new, you know, fangled gadget, widget, entrepreneurs team, what have you. So when you're trying to pitch, or not just when you pitch, but also when you're starting a business, it really is important that your solution is materially better than what's out there. So as I've got on the slide, you know, 10 times better is, you know, not a bad way to go. I would really recommend you've got to be at least twice as good as what they're doing today to even have a chance. You know, you can have, you know, certainly automate some process through software or some other means, and, you know, it's 50%, you know, you save, well, let's say you save 30% on cost. That will be nigh on impossible to sell into the marketplace, generally speaking, because there's so many, you know, even when you do your direct modelling and go, yep, when we look at the man hours and the this and the that, it comes out cheaper. There's that many overheads for a business to change course, coupled with the risk of going with something new. You're just not compelling unless you're at least, you know, twice as good, or, you know, going to save them at least half of the cost for them to move. You know, they've got to retrain, they've got to go through procurement, all this stuff. Like, there's just a lot of overheads. And, you know, it's just worth thinking about that, you know, when you're starting a business, even before you get to the pitching stage, to make sure that your solution, you go, yep, it really is compelling, that people are going to buy that. And ideally, you know, you've tested it either theoretically, because you've gone out and met with potential customers and said, if I could do this, would you buy it? And those sorts of stats, that's what you want to present and, you know, touch on both in the problem about why this is such a big problem, but also in the competition about how you're going to, you know, market yourselves both against the status quo and other people offering solutions. And, you know, generally a red flag for me in a pitch deck is, and this happens more often than you'd think, people who say, and we have no competitors, right? And it happens a lot. But yeah, I would highly recommend you know, find some, because they're out there, or explain, you know, if this technology really is revolutionary, then I'd at least touch on what the status quo is and how you're going to compete against that, how you're going to get businesses to choose you over doing nothing. In terms of illustrating that, you know, I think that there's definitely, you know, a few charts, graphs, things like that you can do. You know, again, this is going to really be a marketing exercise. You know, whenever you do those quadrant type things up here, then, you know, you really want yours top right, whatever it is, you know, flip your axes, rotate it around. That's where people look for successful companies. That's just what, you know, we've all been taught to do. So however you can manage that, make sure you do that. In any feature comparison type things, these are also, I would generally say, as marketing, because, you know, when you come across these features, like, it's almost a certainty that your company is going to tick every box. And the way it ticks every box is that you leave off any features that you're not going to tick, right? So, you know, you want to balance that a little bit, but obviously you're going to need to present your business in the best light possible. That said, I would strongly recommend against leaving off anything that's, you know, material, you know, pretty obvious that they have that you don't have. Because otherwise, when you get to that second meeting and people dig in, and they will, certainly we will, you know, they find stuff, and then it's puts a bit of a sour taste. You go, well, the entrepreneur, you know, is really kind of misrepresenting their business. So you kind of want to, you know, again, tread the fine line, as we did with the team, about presenting your product in the best light, or your solution in the best light, and, not misrepresenting it. So that's a bit of a challenge, but, worth spending some time thinking about how you're going to do that. So in our narrative, we're, moving along here. We've said, here's the problem, here's how we're going to solve it. There's a lot of people with this problem. We're the team to deliver it. There's no other competitors quite like us. The next big question is the business model, which is how are you going to make money, selling what you're selling? This can be more subtle, I think, than it first seems. And also, I think it's more subtle for the businesses themselves, because certainly, before the fact, there's no right or wrong. Whether you charge a large bunch up front and a small amount ongoing, whether you charge, the same kind of recurring revenue, whether you do the razor blade model, which is cheap up front but more money, as you go along, whether you do unlimited quantities, whether you, charge by the hour, charge by usage, charge by computer. There's any which way you can slice and dice this, right? And most often that's going to take some trial and error, and sometimes quite a lot. Pricing is probably, or certainly possibly, one of the most difficult things for a young company to get right. Like, just because there's so many ways you could do it, and there really are. And as I said, there's no right or wrong till after the fact. If you've got a successful business, then you can say, yep, that was right. But I certainly encourage you to give that a lot of thought in both in constructing your business and in the pitch as to, here's what you're charging and here's why it makes sense for the businesses, to pay for these services in this way. And again, ideally, the more customer engagement you've had, then, the more evidence you can provide that this is, the right thing to do. But again, if you don't know and you've just got ideas, I think it's fine to say, here's what we're looking to do. We're going to, A/B test, a bunch of things, and then, scale up on the ones that work. That's not a bad way to go either. I think certainly any sophisticated investor would understand this is tricky to do. This may be why you're raising funds, because, you've had some measure of success, but you want to experiment on, what's the optimal way to sell. The business model is definitely, certainly I think that's evolved, and it evolves over time. I think these days, and again, speaking from my own experience, probably the core ways we think about it is in terms of that CAC, the customer acquisition cost. Like, how much does it cost you to get a customer on board? And then the CLTV, the customer lifetime value. So once they're on board, how much do you make from them? And for basically as a general guide, I'd say, you want that ratio to be 3 or more, so that you make 3 times as much off every customer you get as it costs you to acquire them. Essentially, that number over, and that's only anecdotal is the wrong word, but experimental, it's not based on any science, is that, businesses with that sort of a ratio can afford to spend money on the ancillary costs of running a business, because, the marketing costs directly attributed to acquiring a customer and then the value you get, there's more costs in any business than that. Often parts or most parts of the business, like R&D, management, those sorts of costs aren't included in this. Certain forms of marketing aren't going to be included. So you definitely want to have this raw metric to be very profitable. Because if this isn't profitable, certainly the closer it gets to 1, where, the cost of acquiring them is equal to the amount of money you make, then the less and less chance you have of your business actually making money when it scales up. Also, one of the things to look at with your business model is to think about how that cost of acquisition is going to change over time. For some businesses, for many, the CAC goes up as you try to onboard more people. So for instance, would be Google AdWords. If you start with very small campaigns, like $20 of ads, you're selling that per day, the number of clicks you get is going to be much greater per dollar than when you spend 2,000 and greater, and and it'll get less again when you spend 200,000. Because, as you spend more, like these things don't scale. It's a little bit like supply and demand. So you want to understand, if that's going to be the case with your business. The other thing though, is some businesses, it actually gets less. So if you have any sort of network effect, word of mouth, where the more people you onboard, the more people find out about it, then, there's certainly ways that your CAC actually can, go to zero. So I think one of Atlassian's, favourite stories is that they spend zero on marketing. Essentially, certainly so they started off just marketing to engineers within corporations, and they told their friends, and so on and so on. And at this stage, everyone knows, certainly if you're an engineer, of Atlassian's products. And if you're looking at solving this particular problem of, managing a software development cycle, then most people would always consider Atlassian's products because they've heard about them before from someone else. And so that's a great example of this network effect, just word of mouth, driving their cost of acquisition to zero. The other network effect is if your business truly has a network effect, such as an eBay, where the more sellers you have, the more buyers you have, and the more buyers you have, the more sellers you have, so that when anyone thinks about trying to sell something or buy something, the first place they think of online, at least for those section of goods, would be eBay. Because that's where the most sellers are, or that's where the most buyers are. And that has a very strong network effect, because in terms of, buying, the more choice selection, the more competition you have, generally the better deal you're going to get. So there are definitely some elements you want to think about and explore, when presenting your business model. And again, this is both, in thinking about your business, but then also explaining it to an investor about, why it's going to scale and grow the way that you say it is. Which is the next slide, right? So we've now just said, here's what I'm going to charge each customer. And now you want to get into, so you're kind of getting to the bottom lines here, right? So, all right, if you invest with me, how's this business going to go? And the key message is, we're going to make lots of money, right? That's the message that you need to leave with that investor. And it is funny because, again, I wouldn't say nearly as common as some of the other issues I've raised, but a lot of people present businesses to an investor that actually don't make a lot of money, right? They make a little bit of money, but not a lot. And you really want to understand what an investor, is after when they're making investments. Certainly it's fair to say there are angel investors who are more interested, or at least equally interested, in supporting the ecosystem, and they actually enjoy helping entrepreneurs, and for a small amount of money and a small return, that's all good with them. But if you come to an institutional investor, certainly a venture capital firm, our responsibility to our underlying investors is to make them a lot of money. So we can only do that if our portfolio companies are making a lot of money. So you definitely want to have projections and a business model and, market opportunity that supports that. Generally, 5 years of projections is probably good, because that kind of shows, at least illustrates how the business is going to scale. I think, again, most sophisticated investors would understand that 5 years out is a long way to go. Most, certainly Series A or seed businesses aren't really going to have good visibility past the first year, maybe two. But what you want to present is, if these assumptions, and, perhaps you go through those assumptions, hold true, here's, the sort of money we're going to make. One of the things that at the end of the day, when we're going to make an investment in a company, we're always going to make a leap of faith in terms of, what are we prepared to believe or take on faith about, this opportunity. And that leap or those leaps could come in many forms, like the team. Are they good enough? The problem, like, is it really, such a big problem? Or the solution, like, is it really going to work? Maybe the money, like in pharma, like in life sciences, where Starfish also invests. If you've got a new drug, you've got to put it through, many phases of testing, and there's a real chance it's not going to pass all those phases. And if a drug fails in any of those phases, it's worth zero. So, there's a real leap of faith there that, is that going to work? What you want to do is, similar to this point that I made earlier around focusing on the unknowns, like what the difficult parts of your business are, is again, address these leaps of faith and try to minimize them. So no matter what, there is going to be a leap of faith because there's no certainty in this world, but you just really want to try to address them. And, in your financial projections, you can have those assumptions, particularly out for, the further years, to say, here's what we're thinking, like, if these things hold true, then this is what's going to happen. And that puts the investor kind of in the best position to assess those risks and to see if they're willing to take those risks. And rather than it being this whole big unknowable ball, I go, don't really know this and don't really know that, and who knows what else could be going on. If you can really quantify, what the assumptions around that the business are, particularly in the financial projections, to say, put it down to a nice, neat set that if we can do this, this, and this, then we will make this much money. I think that's a really good way, to get the investor interested, to show that the business has scale, to present those projections out past a point in time where you go, look, we need to experiment on the business model, we need to do this or this, but, make some pretty good assumptions. Then, I think you can make a really good, compelling case, even though, those projections are going to stretch past where you really have solid evidence. So, getting towards the end of your deck, I don't know how we're going on time. Is there even a clock here? Okay, still going all right. You definitely want to get to what you're asking for. Primarily, or most often it's going to be money. Certainly if you come to an institutional investor, that's what you're there for. And, you want to basically say that, this is the only thing that's missing. Like, yes, you've got your assumptions, but you're really on top of those. What we need is this is capital. This is what we're going to use it for. And, we're off to the races. These, and these are the objectives we're going to hit. And you don't always, and often it's quite common, that you're not going to get to, a listing, an IPO, on your first round of money. But what you do want to do is specifically list, here's what we will achieve with this money. And, whether it's profitability or whether it's certain milestones, upon which you can then say, and we're going to raise, and once we've achieved these things, we're going to raise another round. And as long as those objectives are pretty reasonable, that's all okay, certainly for, a venture capital investor. So, that's really just this slide. You don't want to go too much into it. How much money, what you're going to use it for, where you're going to get. You may be asking for other things as well, like expertise or advice, particularly from angel investors. You may want them, to form part of your advisory board or formal board, and that's a good thing to put in there too. Particularly, if you can paint the picture that you could get money from anywhere, but you really want this person for these reasons, a little bit of flattery, that's okay. One of the things I think is generally you don't need to put in your deck is the pre-money valuation. And generally, in fact, I think there's another talk we do about term sheets, but the pre-money valuation, the investors are going to make their own mind up on that. That said, they'll almost always ask, and you should be prepared for an answer. And, possible answers, range from, we think you're the best person to decide what we've achieved so far is worth, make us an offer kind of thing, to actually having a number in mind where you say, yep, $10 million, but, these are the reasons why we think that, but we're open to discussion. But you definitely don't want to present it as, certainly in my opinion, as a, take it or leave it, this is where we're at. Because, unless you really are going to be take it or leave it, then the investors are really going to make their own mind up. And the best way to get a good valuation is to get more than one investor interested. As part of that ask, stuff, I wouldn't put in anything around the deal terms. And again, part of that, getting to a next meeting, that's definitely, down the track. And if you can delay that a bit till they're much more interested in your business, that's also a good thing to do. That said, it is fair to say I will always ask that question because I just want to know if we're in the same ballpark. Because if someone is, early stage and says their pre-money is $20 million, then I can pretty quickly say, look, no matter what you say or do, we're going to be nowhere near that. If you're still willing to talk, let's do it. But otherwise, we don't need to, waste each other's time. So other than, perhaps to get to kind of a ballpark, I wouldn't spend too much on that. And then finally, just have a closing slide and, take questions. Because hopefully you've generated enough interest that they have plenty of questions. I'd definitely be prepared to have, questions along the way. And you should welcome those because the more questions they have along the way, the more interested they are. So that's a good thing. Definitely do not feel like, they're interrupting or, throwing you off your pitch track. You definitely want to be so familiar with your pitch that no matter what the question or where it comes, you can get back on track or reorganize as needed in your mind so that you can take those questions and make them feel welcome. And remember, at the end, you just want to get that next meeting. So, certainly don't feel like you've got to get through everything in that first meeting.